this day, and it has gone so quickly. I'm Jennifer Hill. I'm the board chair of ThoughtRiver, which is the world's most accurate legal AI company. We help negotiate contracts faster to close your deals. And I am here with my two fabulous esteemed panelists, Heather Navo of Ethic and Justin Massa of Newlab. We're going to get started in just a second and hear more about them, but welcome to the How Accurate Does AI Really Need to Be panel. The reason that we've chosen this one for the end of the day is that you've learned so much already about how to think about Gen AI, the ethical implications. We've learned about what not to do and getting in trouble for things, but most importantly, that it can be anything from something that makes your life easier, like a magic wand. It can be a job liberator in so many cases. But what we know over the last 10 months is that it's changed absolutely every aspect of the way that we work, and it's going to gradually change even the way that we live and engage with each other. So I'm excited to dig into this topic today. Heather, please share a little bit more about yourself with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Navo. I am the director of legal at a company called Ethic. We're a startup. We are in the fintech world. Looks like we're going to be sitting.
Take a load off. Come on.
All right,
Come on. Let's relax.
I've been at Ethic for about a year. Before that, I was at Nielsen, the ratings company, for about 4 years. So I've been in-house for about 5 years. And before that, I was at a law firm for about 8 years as a litigator. So that's my background.
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Massa. I'm a senior vice president at Newlab. Newlab is a venture platform that reduces the friction to market for deep technology companies. So we have more than 350 startup members, and we provide access with space and regulatory clearance. We work with governments to foster place-based economic development and create manufacturing jobs of the future. And we work with large companies to help them open up startups as a core innovation pathway as they own their climate futures.
Excellent. Well, let's jump right in. So some of the use cases that we've heard today have ranged everywhere from using generative AI to draft your first email, so pretty low stakes. We've heard higher level things about lawyers using it, and what many of you have read and learned is that even in the healthcare field, we know that a lot of healthcare research and even healthcare providers are relying on it to make healthcare decisions. So one of the first things we should talk about is what happens if you get it wrong? How high are the stakes really? Heather.
So I really want to talk about this example because it's just a phenomenal example if we're thinking about how important is accuracy with AI. And in the world where you're submitting briefs to a court, so you're a commercial litigator and you're signing pleadings, and those briefs say they include support for your statement. They include case law, and you sign your name and you send that off to a judge. By signing your name, you are saying that this is accurate. You are saying that everything in there is truthful. And you have a duty of candor to the court. So what that means is the judge is going to believe that everything in there you checked and is accurate. So about maybe May or so, there was a case where a lawyer did some work. He was writing his brief, and he asked for some help from ChatGPT. And lo and behold, ChatGPT wrote him a beautiful brief. It supported everything he wanted to say in there. The court saw the brief, and they had a bunch of questions because the citations were citing to certain cases, and the quotes were citing to certain cases, and those cases didn't exist. And the judge wrote a letter to the attorney, and the attorney sort of, got his back up a little bit. He didn't think twice about the fact that ChatGPT could have gotten this wrong. He really didn't understand that. Anyway, ChatGPT got it wrong. ChatGPT completely made up cases, delusion, hallucination, whatever you want to call it. And this attorney was sanctioned because this is a really big deal for a lawyer. They got it wrong. The attorney was sanctioned, and there are rules that have come out in certain courtrooms now about disclosing and being transparent about when you use ChatGPT. And the real lesson is, you can use ChatGPT, but one, know the risks, and number two, if you know that if you have the duty of candor, you have to be checking your work and checking the work of ChatGPT.
So this raises the really interesting concept of always having a human in the loop. And this was an example where one would expect particularly when you know you're filing something with a court, that you have to double check. We've all been told you need to proofread, you need to double check their work. They're lessons that have been in our minds since we were young. However, now that we are in the working world, and even for students as well, it reminds us that we have to have a human in the loop, but I feel like that's kind of where the rub is, right? So Justin, tell us more about where you've seen the human in the loop working well, and where you feel like people are just kind of ignoring it and relying on the magic wand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this research was out of MIT a few months ago. I'm not entirely sure. But they were looking at a law firm, interestingly, that was using ChatGPT internally and trying to get an understanding of who actually realized the most benefit from it. And interestingly, they found that it was not the junior employees, rather it was the senior most employees in the firm who realized the most benefit from AI. And I think that's because when kind of those senior lawyers were the humans in the loop, they actually knew what was right and what was wrong, right? Like if they had gotten some of those fake cases, I think they probably would have caught it a little bit sooner given their seniority and their tenure. So the way that I kind of think about it, like I think human in the loop is important, but it needs to be the right human in the loop. So the metaphor I like to use for artificial intelligence or generative AI is think about it like a local tour guide. It's like I grew up in New Orleans, and you go to the city and you take a tour of the French Quarter, and I would take friends when they came and visited, and 80% of it's like pretty close, and like 20% of it's just like completely made up. But all of it sounds right. And so if you go to New Orleans as a tourist and you take one of those tours, like, take it all with a grain of salt. But when I take that tour, I know exactly what's true and what's not. And I think the same is true of AI. So you need to understand it like a local tour guide. And if you happen to be from that town, it can be an incredibly effective tool for you to use. And if you're not, it's really hard to know what's wrong and what's right.
So this is almost like an area where it is a work enhancer, and it actually enhances your work the more that you know and the more value that you bring, because you have to actually look and double check or say, does this directionally sound accurate? My last company that I worked with was a health tech company, and we had a rule of thumb when we were using internal tools, which a lot of product developers might find squeamish. We would say when we first started using it, is it 60% accurate? And when my product team looked at me, they looked at me like I had three heads. Why would I ever release something that's 60% accurate? And we said, first, well, it's not a release to the public. It's a release internally. And the reason for that is I know they're incredibly qualified, skilled people that are looking at what it spits out, and they can so much more quickly say, this looks right, this isn't right, and does it err on false positive or false negative? And I think that's actually a really important point when you're either using it or building something that uses it, is how to think about with your teams the false positive and the false negative. I'd be curious about how you manage that issue.
Go for it.
So, yeah, I think it's really important how you intend to use the AI. Are you using it internally? Are you using it externally? Those are two completely different use cases, and the risks totally change depending on if it's internal or external. For us, look, I'm in a highly regulated industry, financial services. A lot of rules and restrictions around what we're doing every day. The SEC is very active. The SEC has proposed rules already about AI. So we have to be really careful. But let's take an example. When we're doing something for internal use only, for example, like summaries of our meetings or summaries of our notes, if we get it wrong at the end of the day, it's not the biggest deal. If we have some false negatives, false positives, whatever we have, it just means somebody else doesn't have to be taking notes and spending half an hour or an hour after a meeting and writing that all down. So at the end of the day, like the risk is low, and we're totally fine on an internal basis. External, totally different situation where we have a lot of customers, we have a lot of clients. That means personal information. We are really careful about what we're doing with our customers and clients' personal information, and the risk assessment is completely different.
So I've been encouraging every company I talk to really invest in kind of figuring out how to get comfortable internally with starting to use these tools, right? Because my perspective right now is every company on earth should be actively experimenting internally with how to use artificial intelligence. And that if you are launching a product to your customers powered by generative AI without a human in the loop, I am terrified for you. Like, we are right at that dividing line of you need to be getting ready for when the controls, the privacy, the risk mitigation is at a point where it can go public. And if you wait until that point to start to work with all this stuff, you're going to be massively behind. So that's kind of the first thing that I think about. The second thing that I think about is, ChatGPT kind of took the world by storm, and then we had Bard, and then we have Claude, and I mean, there's a whole host of them. And almost all of them look exactly the same, right? Like, they're these conversational chat-based interfaces, which frankly have like very little design affordances to them, right? You know, like the tool itself doesn't actually do a very good job of helping you understand how to use the tool. And so I think kind of, to me, the horizon on this is, are there interaction patterns, design affordances, like very different kinds of experiences that someone can have with artificial intelligence that actually lead those systems to naturally be more accurate by kind of marrying the human in the loop and the AI itself? And I'm not going to pretend I know what those are. Like, I think a lot of these have not yet been invented. But like, if I was worried about accuracy, I'd probably be less concerned about improving models in themselves and much more concerned with figuring out what are the interaction patterns between humans and machine that lead us to naturally improve the accuracy over time.
Then this sounds like for most companies also a policy decision. And I would imagine that there's so many different companies, small and large, that are setting rules internally about what teams can and can't do. And of course, if you're setting a policy which says don't experiment with AI, you should assume that everyone's doing it anyway. Hopefully you have enough insight into what your employers are doing that they're not putting the really, really proprietary and sensitive data sets on there. But you'd make the base level assumption that everyone's doing it anyway. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear some examples of companies, you do not need to name names, industry would be great, that are setting policies well, or ones where you feel like they're really missing the mark because they have such a stranglehold and are so concerned about the worst possible thing that could happen.
Well, I'll give an example, and I don't, maybe this happened 2 months or so ago, where, and maybe you know which company I'm talking about. I don't remember the name. It's happening to everybody, but the policy was that people were actually allowed to use ChatGPT and Bard and these LLMs, and the engineers were using it, which that always makes me the most scared because they're putting in the most sensitive data in the companies. They're putting in the source code, and these employees, the policy was that they were not allowed to use it, and then about a couple days later, they changed the policy, and suddenly they allowed the company to start using it. What do you think happened in those after they allowed people to start using it? You guessed it. So there was a giant data leak, and because of the data leak, a lot of the source code got leaked. It was, I'm forgetting the company. Do you remember who it was?
I'm not blanking on it.
Okay, but and that was it was a complete disaster for the company. Very, very high profile, very, very high risk, and that is the most sensitive data that the company has. So the policy is good, and I'm glad that like people were following the policy. Here, the people followed the policy, and they still had this issue. So policies are super important. We're working on that at my own company, and I think one of the most important things is to like have the right people in the room when you're generating the policy. It's a cross-functional team. It's not just legal. It's not just compliance. You want your product team there. You want your marketing team there because there are a lot of the people who are using these kinds of tools and applications. You want almost like a cross-functional team from every part of the business so that you're getting all the voices heard and you're thinking about the risks from all the different perspectives.
So I'm going to maybe tackle this from like a slightly different angle, building on what you said. So I think there's another way to think about policy here, which is who's going to benefit from this, right? Mm-hmm. So there are some companies, very large, that have said things like, we are not going to hire thousands of accountants because we're going to use AI to do it instead. And I have a strong suspicion that there are 0 accountants at that company today who are experimenting with what AI might do on behalf of their employer. I mean, to your point, they're all using it today. Let's not pretend they're not, but they're using it for their benefit, not the business's benefit. And in that very moment creates massive risk for the organization and presumes like they're, cutting off your nose to spite your face. Like you're guaranteeing you're not going to see employee-led innovation around AI. I know of other companies that have said from the C-suite, no one's going to lose their job to AI. This is about growth and everyone benefits. And those companies have created a plethora of internal experiments that are rapidly advancing, that are some are public, some are private. And I think the thing that's really striking to me is that the benefits of AI, there is more than enough to go around. And I think that if companies have a policy of the only people who benefit from AI are the business and the owners, they are going to invite massive problems and, frankly, be slower to innovate than many others. If your policy is, we are all going to benefit in this, I think you can create a virtuous cycle that, in an interesting way, mitigates risk.
I completely agree. And this is such an interesting cross-section of how corporate policy, how legal policy, how the way people develop products and services, all of this has come together. And this is a lot to think about on the best of times, let alone in the last 10 months when all of this is moving so quickly. So with that in mind, I mean, how do you think teams should think about this, particularly when the speed at which AI is moving is just not the same speed at which most companies and even startups have to move?
This is a tough one. I mean, the advice that I've been giving to teams, like so far, is that you need to start trying it. Like, if you're not experimenting with it, you're already behind. And, to what we've already said, there's a bit of diligence and risk mitigation and, reviewing data privacy agreements and executing things with the AI companies. You need to do in order to get to that point. I'll share a quick story here. So I've been at Newlab for about 2 months. Before that, I was at IDEO. And earlier this year, we were actually making technology products built on generative AI. And I remember we were meeting with the team. This is probably March. And we're I wonder if we could make ChatGPT return perfect JSON. And the team just decided to try it. And we're wow, it 80% of the time, it's we get pretty good JSON back. And 2 weeks later, it's in the documentation. And I think in that story, I'm not gonna pretend IDEO came up with this wildly novel thing. I mean, other people were doing it at the same time. But I think in a very different way than in the past, the pace of change of this technology completely changes the paradigm. So I have a metaphor that I'll share. So I was at a conference earlier this year, and this guy, Mike, who's the CEO of Ada, they're a customer service chatbot, was kind of talking about technology from stage, and he said, anybody remember the flashlight app on the iPhone? When the iPhone was brand new, and that app took off, right? It was #1 on every app chart, and everybody loved it. And then as soon as flashlight became a core feature of the iPhone, no one has ever downloaded it again. And, to make it complicated for product teams, I'm really worried that a lot of solutions and companies, maybe even industries, are just flashlight apps of the AI, right? A thing that today feels incredibly differentiated and valuable may just be something the AI does tomorrow. And I think that significantly complicates the work that product development and software teams need to do in order to understand this. There's all of the challenge of just actually using the technology unto itself. And then there's this second layer, which is that it is constantly changing the paradigms in ways that are nonlinear and very hard to predict.
This concept of experiment is really an important one because it kind of takes the pressure off. I mean, if you're not looking at it as a silver bullet or something that's going to save our business or is going to achieve, X, Y, and Z, whatever your corporate goals are, but it's just that, it's an experiment, then it makes it easier to ratchet your expectations appropriately and to change it. It's kind of like objectives and key results, OKRs. The goal is not to hit 100%, the goal is to hit 70. And if you hit 70, you're killing it. That means you're doing really well because you're kind of just going beyond and testing to see where you want to be. And it kind of goes the same thing for AI accuracy. So if you are a healthcare provider and you are using AI to, for example, look at x-rays, there's been a lot of research and documentation to show that AI actually can pick up abnormalities more effectively than humans. However, I don't think there's anybody here that would want the AI diagnosing their health condition. They would want a human to do that. And so then it's the pairing of having a thinking human that knows how to look at the false positives from the false negatives, that can see how the AI can perhaps speed up their work, but ultimately the ones making a decision. If you're writing a first draft of an email, stakes are super low. If you've got data for a customer service app, maybe you decide to set your experimentation level somewhere in the middle, increasing it every quarter. So it's kind of context and subject dependent. I'd be curious how you feel about code, though. That's one area of AI that we haven't really touched on. AI is doing a lot of things, but it also can be used to generate code. So how do you think of accuracy in terms of code generation? And Heather, I'm going to ask you because you are in a regulated industry and you have a very heavy technology component to what Ethic does.
We do. We have a very highly regulated and highly proprietary source code. We have our own platform. We have a lot of our own tech. And our engineers are excited to use this. I've been trying to keep them at bay, honestly. It's very hard. And I can't comment on accuracy, but I can comment on the fact that like it is just so risky right now from the dual perspectives of one, data leakage, which we talked about already, but also from an IP perspective. There's the IP has two different aspects to it. There's what happens when we actually put our source code into the model, where's it going to go? But then there's the other aspect of if we're going to be getting source code from the model, can that be coming from a competitor? Are we taking someone's source code? Are we going to then see a copyright suit potentially? And that's a really big problem. It hasn't been solved yet, and that's one of the reasons that we have been trying to avoid putting our source code up on any of these models right now. But if you know more about accuracy, tell us.
I mean, I mean, to maybe a theme of this event, like, human in the loop. I think it depends on how is the software developer human in the loop with the code. So, like, I would be terrified if a software engineer were like going to AI and being like, here's all the source code, tell me what's wrong with it. But if a software engineer is not going to the AI and being like, hey, I need to provision this thing really quickly, can you do it for me? They are wasting their time, right? So I think there are, like, I don't know if anybody listens to the podcast Possible. It's Reid Hoffman and can't remember the other woman's name. It's wonderful, highly recommend it. They have a number of episodes about AI, and in one of them they're talking to some software developers. And they're like, look, like, AI is not going to write the incredibly hard function that is going to uniquely create value for my company. But it's absolutely going to handle setting up a username and password, because who cares about doing that anymore? So I think, to me, it's about, like, working with software teams and figuring out how to get them into a rotation where they are constantly pushing off those things that you have to do to build technology that frankly don't create differentiated value, and spend all of their time focusing on creating differentiated value and don't put it in the chatbot.
But Justin, you're opening Pandora's box.
Yes, I am.
You're letting your engineers, let's just talk about this for a second. You're letting your engineers make a judgment call on what they can and can't be putting into, is it important, is it not important, is this helpful, is this full code, not full code, and how do you get to feeling comfortable with that?
You're going to hate my answer. They're doing it anyway. I mean, like, let's not pretend they're not, right? And so I think I would much prefer, nobody lawyer wants to hear that. I think I would much prefer to have a collaborative relationship where they feel comfortable telling me what they're doing with it and not doing it, so I can, like, nudge and give feedback and evolve them towards a more kind of risk mitigated and compliant place, rather than what I fear happens in many places, which is like, you're not allowed to do this, and it's like, fine, I'm just going to do it when you're not looking.
I don't know, so it sounds to me like a lot of the predictions we've heard earlier that AI is not coming to take everyone's jobs away, because the humans have to be in the loop, and frankly, the more educated and skilled human, the better.
Yes.
I don't know.
I mean, to the whole tour guide thing, like, I am certainly, like, I don't write software myself, right? Like, I work with a lot of engineers. I would feel not all that comfortable trying to give, like, prescriptive guidance to an engineer about, like, what code should go in and what code should go out. But I feel really comfortable having a conversation with them about the business risks, and then trying to, like, impress upon them some kind of a paradigm or understanding that, like, probably need to evolve over time, but, like, they would kind of, like, own themselves, which is a little risky.
So in the mix of, like the velvet glove over the fist, how do you manage teams? And how do you manage, particularly teams that are newer both in working together and newer with working with the technology, and, frankly, new just working within a more structured environment?
You know what? I'm working in extreme startups environments these days, and so they are just inherently less structured. I'm being honest. What are you thinking, Heather?
Yeah, so I work at this startup is Series C, venture backed. It's about 7 or 8 years old, and we are just not in a place at this time where our engineers can be putting in the source code. And I, as the director of legal, I just don't yet feel comfortable that we have, let's call it 30 engineers, that I can say, you can put in some of the source code, but don't put in all the source code. Or you can put in the source code that, like, maybe doesn't have all the source code, but but has little pieces so that, if in case it gets leaked, like, we're okay. I love your view. I applaud your risk-taking. I don't think the company that I'm in is ready to be doing that yet. I don't think the industry is ready in terms of like the LLMs being ready for that. I don't think my company in particular is at that risk. And it all is dependent on what company you're at and the risk that you are ready to take. Our company isn't, for the source code, that would be too much for us.
I mean, I think I think in your answer, Heather, is like the lesson I would take for everyone here is like you need to arrive at this own standard for your company, given where your organization is today, right? Like, I think there are critical functions inside of businesses where the risk of engaging with AI now, like, may simply be too great. Like, no, nothing touches it. I am certain there are large chunks of every company on earth that don't fit that criteria. And it could simply be a thing of like, all right, there are certain areas where we are not leveraging this. It is off the table. But all of this is on the table, and in fact, we're going to encourage it and support it, and here's what that looks like. Because my fear is that if teams, put it a different way, my theory of change of what's going to happen is we're going to see a series of step changes over time as models improve, right? Like, if you think about the change from 3.5 to 4, and then from 4 to now multimodal, and then from multimodal to integrating with the doing AI, like the Bard and Assistant announcement. So as these step changes happen, if the organization is like sitting down here because you've said no, that's a lot to jump up to try and catch up with everyone else. And so my paradigm is like, stay on the most recent rung. Maybe don't do it for all of your business, but if you're on that most recent rung, when we hit that threshold of where we can effectively manage the risk, you'll be able to turn it on very, very quickly.
It's an interesting point, particularly related to places where companies might feel that it's safer. So when you talk about the rungs, I mean, productivity tools are a really easy place to start. And what that does is essentially replace software. I mean, I think now a lot of the tools that we use, to your point about the flashlight app, once it becomes a native part of some other environment that we work in, then that previous functionality goes away. And maybe that's a small and safer place to play. And as they become more comfortable with it, then adoption gets higher. It also makes it easier to peg accuracy, right? Because the stakes are low and you've kind of got some experimentation. So we've got this concept of experimentation. You're kind of setting your boundaries where they need to be for your industry, for your comfort level, knowing that people are trying the crazy stuff anyway. Hopefully you have good policies around it. We'll assume everybody does. If not, you can always ask your lawyer. But let's talk about predictions. So one of mine is that the way in which we think through prompts and the way that we engage with ChatGPT and similar applications like that is going to change the way that we engage with software in general and things in general. Our brains will start to become more wired as we engage with that, as to thinking about how do we get that next right bit of information to get me a more accurate answer. And it sounds like from what we've seen today, some of that is clearly happening already. I mean, there's applications that are changing overnight for real, true natural language search and prompts that really replicate human thought and that yield a better answer. So Heather, any predictions?
Well, before I even get to predictions, I have to say, putting in prompts is a real skill. I thought it would just be like Google search, where you like type in some words and you get a response. Until I started using it, and actually I saw my nieces and nephews who were so much better at it than I was, until you start using it, you realize that like the more you use it and the more you understand how it works, the better you're going to be at actually getting good results and getting results that are really tailored to you. Knowing for it to say like, I want it back in a humorous way. I want this, explain this to me as if I'm an 8th grader. Like giving it those right prompts makes all the difference. And the more you use it, the more you're going to understand how it works and how to get the best results. So I highly recommend like just throwing in some questions today and like getting some responses. Maybe for your next vacation. I did it for my last vacation. For predictions, look, Justin said something in our prep call the other day, which I would love to hear more about, because you said you saw some degradation in the system, because my prediction was going to be this is only going to get better over time. That we've, over the last, 9-10 months, we've seen an amazing transformation. And then we were talking to Justin, was it yesterday, the day before, and he said he's seen major degradation. Yes. So let's talk about that for a second, I think, if we're talking about predictions.
Yeah, so I think I'll frame it in the form of a prediction. Like, my prediction is that it's really hard to predict what the hell's going to happen next. Like, incredibly hard to predict what's going to happen next. So I've been using. I've struggled to like find my vibe with Bard. I use Claude and ChatGPT fairly extensively. I've used Code Interpreter. I think it's now called like Data Analyst or something. I have noticed. I'm a huge fan of ChatGPT, but like a significant degradation in Data Interpreter like over the last couple of weeks. Like the hallucinations have gotten really, really bad. Right around the same time that like Claude was getting much better. The fun thing, which neither of you know, is that last night I had Claude hallucinate on me so incredibly badly. Like, I kept going with it because it kept giving me links to a Google spreadsheet it said it had made for me. And I was like, you can't make Google spreadsheets. And it just kept doing it. They were fully formatted and looked right, and you click on them and nothing was there. It was really interesting. So I think the thing that's interesting about the models is, nobody really understands how these things work. Like, just to be totally honest about it. Like, there are great theories about how they work, but all of the models have exhibited truly emerging capabilities, which are things the models did not do when they were first released, that over time, without a change in the model, they gain the ability to do. And no one is entirely clear that's happening. And we're now far enough into it where some of them have also lost some of those capabilities, and there's also no explanation for why. And so I think when we were building the software earlier this year, I think in the span of like the 2 months that we were building the software on it, they added and depreciated 5 or 6 models in like a very short period of time. And so I think we're in a place where those companies are not primarily focusing on launching models that are going to stick and be durable over time. Their primary goal is to very quickly launch models, to get a lot of people to use them, to give them a bunch of feedback so they can improve their tuning and evolve the models over time. And so I think that dynamic makes for like a really hard to predict future.
It does, particularly given that everything that's put in there is kind of out in the open, and unless you're building your own Gen AI models based on your own proprietary data set, that is one way to think about the accuracy meter as well. If you've trained it, if you've set the parameters, if it's on a data set that you know well, and there's less outside influence, then you might not have degradation. You actually might have a huge enough uplift that clears whatever hurdles you've set internally.
So okay, I'm going to build on that because I've won I'm kind of confident in this prediction. So I think right now, like in ChatGPT, you can like give it some custom instructions and give it some stuff about your identity. Claude has no idea who you are from exchange to exchange. When Bard and Assistant merge, it might know stuff from your email. But I think the challenge right now is like you're constantly starting fresh. And so it means that you need to kind of do a bunch of like AI busy work, like give the model time to think and teach it some things and tell it all those strategies that you can use to get really good outcomes. And it's just like annoying. I mean, like I'm at the point now where like I'm prompting. There's like 5 minutes of me just like setting it up before I really get into like the thing I'm trying to do that's different this time. I think that's going to meaningfully change. So I think that our ability not to do like full-scale tuning of models, I think that's maybe a couple of years away for like single individual purposes. But I think that kind of our ability to like lightly tune a model that is more durable over time for a very specific use case is probably not that far away. Like I'm hoping end of this year. If not, I bet it's very early next year.
That would be super fast.
Oh, it's going to save so much time.
It's going to save so much time.
And it already does. I mean, it's wild how much time it saves us already.
It's true. It's true. We've got some time for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? All right. There we go. We've got Ben with a mic. Okay.
The mic is on the way.
Hi. Really excited to hear you talk about the pace of innovation and the pace of learning. I'm curious to hear about how you've heard organizations meet this increased pace of learning with the ability to research as fast and the ability to disseminate those learnings throughout the organization, whether you're dog fooding or making something for external users.
You want to take that one first?
I've heard. I'm aware of a large number of what I could only call like AI science fairs inside of large companies that have been happening this year. So I think for those companies that have chosen to like encourage their workforces to experiment within kind of guardrails, they're kind of figuring out ways to do it. It's early days, right? Like I don't have like you should follow this model, but I do think there's very much a spirit of like show your work, invite others to engage. The one thing I will say is I've met a couple of organizations who have established centralized functions where there's a depth of expertise in AI that then can collaborate in kind of a federated model with other parts of the company. So it's not like every company is, every part of the company is trying to like bring in their own AI developers, whatever that means. And so I do think like that seems to be a best practice. Like, very large organizations have teams of like 5-7 people that will then kind of go off and work with other parts of the business. And that's like, I think, the one thing that I would probably encourage. But past that, I think it's really just that spirit of like, show your work.
I also think it's forcing the question of companies of how they communicate internally, and that actually has to happen a lot faster. So the traditional model of maybe we have a meeting once a quarter or once a month or a biannual offsite, that's too slow now. I mean, the ability to communicate and share ideas and, frankly, discuss change has to happen in smaller groups and more interactive forums. So I really think companies are starting to rethink how do we engage our teams so that we're all on the same page and we can continue pushing ourselves in a, not in a terrible way, in a way that allows us to do our best work. Yep.
Hi. So what's your thinking on how long before AI becomes super intelligent, and what's your concern about everybody being put out of work?
Why don't I start there, and then you can add. I would say that there seems to be a pretty, extreme view. There are some that are truly afraid that it will take away jobs, and there are others that will say it accelerates the human. I think one way to think about it is what problems is the AI solving? For example, is it routine work that is suitable for automation? I mean, that's been happening for over 100 years in different ways. And so that's kind of the natural progression of technology and how people think. So in that regard, are there some jobs that will go away? Yes, there are. And ideally, both communities, governments, and companies are looking at how they can retrain and upskill people, because that's absolutely a societal responsibility as we adopt more AI. I would say that for a growing number of jobs and professions and areas of research, AI is actually upskilling the human, and it makes the human more valuable because it frees up that human's time to do more valuable work. So let me give you one quick example, which is, we'll say we're biased because we're lawyers, but actually there's been a lot of noise within the legal community about the adoption of AI, and there are lawyers that are afraid it will take jobs, and there are lawyers that think it accelerates it. As someone who practiced for many years, I would say I am delighted for the AI to come through hundreds of documents in a matter of seconds and find me the bits of information I need, because my main joy and what my human skills and experience do is actually to provide advice and guidance to my clients. And in that way, AI can help me do that more effectively and get on to the next hardest thing that adds value. Well, so Justin and Heather, do you think there will be a supercomputer that will put all of us out of business?
I'm not worried about it from a lawyer's
I mean, the inner lazy
perspective.
person in me is like, this sounds great. Like, we don't work. I mean, like, hey. But I don't know. I was a teacher earlier in my career, and I'm a big fan of this guy, Howard Gardner from Harvard University, who talks about the idea of like multiple intelligences. And school's really good at kind of arithmetic and language arts, but like it's not so good at like teaching you like spiritual intelligence. Like there's many kinds of emotional intelligences. When I think about like we talk about AI as super intelligence, I think it's actually we gloss over this idea of multiple intelligences, and I don't think like the AI is going to have like incredibly robust emotional intelligence all that soon. Like, so I think there's a whole bunch of types of intelligences that the AI, I don't know if it's ever going to have, just to be totally blunt. Like, there's very little evidence of it being able to have those things right now that like make me freak out that like, oh, it's going to take all of our jobs. The other thing I'll share though is like, I mean, my perspective is that there is significant benefit from AI, and as we go through those series of step changes over time, that benefit's going to increase. And I think there is a very open question about who is going to realize that set of benefits, right? Like, there's a really, I think, wonderful example right now, with people who are creators and artists and people who write words, whose language and work is absolutely part of training these systems. How are they going to participate in this benefit that is now being created for? And I'm not here to I don't have like a wonderful policy idea, like the effective altruism is interesting. I don't know if they can pull it off, but like, I think there is a real question that we have to answer about as we get to that kind of tipping point where it is disrupting more jobs than it is creating value. How do we handle that as a society?
Heather, any final thoughts to add?
The only thing I was going to say is that, look, it's going to be changing jobs, that's for sure. I think, but we have to change with the technology. You either have to like grow with the technology or you're going to be left behind. I will say, from like a legal perspective, and maybe this is naive of me, but I feel like from somebody who's constantly counseling people in a room and who is using judgment and who has to be answering questions in real time, and I mean, that could be based on books where like maybe AI can answer it, but I mean, these are real-time conversations. They are answering in the moment. They are answering based on things that I know. Sometimes the answers I don't know. And I don't see that being replaced, at least in the near future, anytime soon.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Yes.
So this isn't the question I thought I was going to ask, but in response to the emotional piece, ChatGPT can already simulate emotional awareness pretty well. If you ask it to write something, and then you say, do that again, but lighter-hearted, or more amusing, or more formal, or any change in tone that you want to request, it will do it, and it will iterate on that until it's as lighthearted as you please. So how can you distinguish that from emotional awareness? If emotional awareness is simulated well enough, we're not going to be able to tell. We all have friends who simulate it, and it's not real, and it can be very hard to tell there.
I mean, like the AI, like ChatGPT is not going to like put its hand on its shoulder and like look me in the eye and like breathe heavily in a moment when it needs to emotionally connect with me, right? Like, I think we should not be confused that intelligence is only expressed in words and images. It's expressed in the wide variety of ways that we as humans engage with one another, right? Like, I talk with my hands. You've been watching me do it for the last 45 minutes. I don't know when the AI is going to talk with its hands. And me talking with my hands, pandemic was real frustrating, y'all, because I couldn't talk with my hands. Like, I ended up getting one of those cameras that was like further away, wide angle, because I don't know how to communicate without my hands. So I think I think we need to think kind of expansively about the human experience and not fall into this kind of trap that the things that AI can do can encapsulate the entire richness of the human experience.
But that said, does it bring up some risks around deep fakes and ways to simulate engagement between humans, online, in the ether, and those non-interpersonal communications? 100%. We've been seeing that for years anyway, and that's only getting better, and that absolutely is a risk. Yes.
I'm sorry. I think what I'm hearing here is what we had to do is shift, like you say, change the way we do things, because artificial intelligence is gonna tell, like you said, words, but affections, understanding, and now with the mental health issues that our communities are having, we're gonna need that personal touch. So I think we are just getting afraid of nothing. Instead of being scared, we should be prepared. What do you think?
Right. Thinking about it on how we can use it to help us be more human and help us increase connection is absolutely one excellent frame to think about it.
Any other questions?
There's a couple behind you.
Thank you very much for having this presentation. I'm learning a lot from it. There's something you said about medical diagnosis. You know, we have a shortage of doctors right now. And the data indicates, like in radiology, in general, it's 73% accurate, but with abnormal x-rays, it's up to 99% accurate. And the real key is x-rays are really good, and it's a good way for the audience and everyone to understand. It's really good for AI because it uses machine language and machine learning, rather, whereas you have millions and millions of x-rays that go into the database, millions of x-rays, and the software actually learns from that. So anything that is applicable to machine learning works really well with AI. And with the shortage of doctors, I think it's possible that it could serve an important role.
I think it's a great example of where it can really speed up that time. And if it can do a lot of work, but you still need a provider, a doctor in the loop, given that how pressed providers are already in this country for time with patients, things that help free it up are really important.
We're almost out of time. We got time for one last question. Anyone over here?
There's one
One that's going right where? Raise your hand.
There's one right behind
great.
you.
Excellent.
Gentleman in the back at the cocktail table.
First off, great talk. Thank you so much for that thought-provoking conversation. It's the first real big AI talk I've heard this year. Question, I'll preface with an example. The role of a sales engineer 7 years ago was created because of sales team and engineer, that kind of gap in the middle of moving the sales cycle along a lot faster. What role do you think, or roles do you think within companies will be created to be that kind of middle translator, so to speak, or somebody that within chat and this AI, someone within the organization that may understand it very well, that may move into a different type of role? We are going to probably effectively lose certain roles within companies, and it's a great way for companies to replace. What are some of those?
Justin, you want to take this one? Because I know you've had some experience in this area recently, so I'll let you start.
Yes. I'll start with maybe a funny metaphor. It's like I started my career in the nonprofit world, and there was this phrase, a long time ago, the accidental techie. Like the one person in the nonprofit who knew how to run the networking cables in the ceiling and set up all the computers. And then you kind of evolved into technology. And so I think there's a lot of people in companies right now that are like the accidental prompt engineer. They're like the person on the team who's kind of figured out how to do it. And I observe these people all over the place. I mean, 4 or 5 of them in my company, I count myself as one of them. We are in constant demand. And I think it's a mixture of some people just want us to do the work for them, but a lot of them are very eager to learn what we have learned. And so my hunch is that there will absolutely be some people who just don't lean into this, right? They don't try, they don't want to mess with it. I think more and more people are going to kind of upskill themselves to where, the sales engineer of 7 or 8 years ago, that salesperson can now be the sales engineer themselves, right? The other thing, though, that gets really interesting is I was telling Jennifer and Heather about this earlier. I figured out a technique to use Claude to bootstrap and get lead data and then turn it into a markdown table and then give it other data about our offerings and then have it write my outbound emails and then send them all, which is great. So it used to be a thing that would take an individual contributor a couple of weeks to get ready for me. I can now do in an hour, which is awesome. But it then means I've got way more phone calls I got to do. I got way more follow-ups I have to engage in. And so I think it kind of shifts the nature of some of the work to those things that, frankly, if we can offload it to the computer, let you do it, and us humans will do the things that only humans can do, understanding someone's need on a qualifying call or engaging with them on site to understand, is that team really aligned? All of those things, I don't know. I mean, AI is a long way from knowing whether or not a group of 10 humans are aligned about doing a thing. That is a core function of sales. I really want my sales team doing a lot of that.
Yeah. And I think it's such a great place for sales engineers, frankly, to shine, especially right now, because there's so many tools out there, and there's so many that, frankly, will get replaced by AI, that understanding how they can uniquely solve for what your business is and how to get those right, highly qualified leads and get them through the funnel faster, that is always going to be a valuable skill, and a human's always going to need to be in that loop regardless of the technology that's doing it. Ideally, you're just hitting your numbers that much faster.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's buying $1 million deal from AI anytime soon.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining this panel today and for thinking through all the different aspects of AI. There's been so much interesting learning across every dimension, how to finance companies, how they're changing companies, how to think about whether AI is accurate. And we hope that you've come away from today with tools and frameworks to think about the problems that you want to solve, that you've met some fabulous people and the vendors and in the audience to help you solve them, and that you've come away thinking about the next hardest challenge that you as a human want to solve. Thank you, and thank you to Heather and Justin. Thank you for joining us today.
Give a huge round of applause to these guys.